This video volume in our documentary collection winds up our narrative of World War II operations. It will begin with two campaigns in the Pacific. The first of these shows our B-29s against Japan. We see the giant super forts taking off from bases in China and the newly captured Pacific Islands, destroying Japanese industry and disrupting communication and transportation systems.
August 1943, Canada. At the first Quebec conference, Allied chiefs were planning new strategy. Expecting European victory in a year, the Allies now marshal their forces against Japan. The President knew that distances had put a premium on long-range air power. To strike Japan, he had a new weapon. Roosevelt promised 200 B-29 superforts by March 1944.
Inside the Chateau Frontenac at the Joint Chiefs Conference, General Arnold proposed to pierce the inner zone of Japan's homeland with the unbuilt bombers from bases to be erected in China. It was a bold plan. At the time of the Quebec Conference, we only had 11 superforts. Hap Arnold's motto was to become famous. He announced, "The difficult we do immediately. The impossible takes a little longer." There were only 7 months to keep the promise. It was a race with time.
We aircraft workers came from all walks of life. A few of us had built planes in World War I. We were a part of the strength of America, now working for Boeing, Bell, and Martin. Their factories had sprung up across the country, in Georgia, Kansas, Nebraska, in the state of Washington. Things had certainly changed. In 20 years, America's aviation industry had come of age. Unskilled workers became highly productive because the cranes and jigs and tools were so designed. Boeing engineers helped us make a new wing that could carry more weight faster and higher than any we'd ever built. In each plane, there were 55,000 numbered parts. Thousands of miles of wiring, 1,000,000 rivets. From its transparent nose to its tail, this was a complicated machine. Nevertheless, the Air Force ordered the assemblies like pieces for a giant jigsaw puzzle. By December, only 4 months after the President's promise, we put together 35 superforts. Then, every hour of every day, identical miracles of modern machinery were brought together. We workers witnessed an inspiring sight, a welding of vision and reality, of free men and their need for peace, of national defense and American industry. Building the superfort was the climax in the history of man's conquest of the air. Bring to reality the dreams of Billy Mitchell and Frank Andrews, the plans of Hap Arnold and Tooey Spotts. Thus, the 99-foot-long aerial giant, spreading 141-foot wings, was born. By the end of January, 142 superforts were accepted. 3/4 of America's promise and our pipelines were full. Here were 65 tons of fighting fury, the biggest, fastest, and most powerful bomber in the world. Now our sons and brothers could take the B-29 to war.
In sharp contrast, halfway around the world in China, the other half of the superfort miracle unfolded. Armies of laborers were building a network of air bases almost by hand. lean, sinewy Chinese, measuring their work by the remaining Earth pyramids, wrote a magnificent chapter in the saga of the Superfort, 2,000 years after their ancestors had built the Great Wall for the defense of China. Here were the same primitive methods: baskets and hoes, muscles and goodwill, and wheelbarrows which squeaked to keep imaginary devils away. With the machinery of only their million hands, stone by stone was patiently set. A modern Chinese wall was taking shape. Under the direction of 26 American officers and enlisted men, and at a cost of $150 million, 1,000-men gangs, following their own flagmen, rolled out 4 great air bases.
April 24th became a day for us in the 20th Bomber Command to remember. General Saunders and Colonel J. Carman led the B-29 parade into Chengdu. Nearly all the immense airfields were ready for business. They had been built in only 3 months. Here was our Superfort. It had hopped the Atlantic, Africa, and India. It flew from Kansas to China in a week. It didn't seem possible, but only a year and a half after the first experimental B-29 was flown, a fleet of American aerial dreadnoughts were arriving in China. Next stop, Japan. Within 10 days, our Asiatic strength was 130 superforts. Directed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff because of our long range and power, we were the first units of the 20th Air Force. The President's promise was being kept. With more superforts on the way, the runway builders never stopped. In China, a land of miracles, unskilled hands were pounding out a path to victory.
Meanwhile, in Japan, 1,500 miles to the east, other hands had forged a modern war machine. Geared for war since 1928, their production rolled on. Like the Germans, they believed their empire invulnerable. Since Pearl Harbor, steel capacity had doubled. 1/3 was hammered into ships, ships to exploit conquered lands, ships to support far-flung military forces. Though suffering from shipping sunk by the Allies, Japan maintained the world's 3rd largest merchant fleet with continued launchings. Their island empire with Korea and Manchuria, connected by an efficient merchant marine, formed an industrial empire 3 times larger than Germany. Their ground forces had expanded to 5 million fanatics, nearly 4 times their strength at the time of Pearl Harbor. As the conquerors of 500 million people, they had to be stopped.
By June, our bases in China were working around the clock. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had ordered an attack on Japan. How many bombers could be sent? Our answer was 50. Not enough. Get at least 70. A maximum effort was necessary. It would relieve enemy pressure in East China, help the invasion of Saipan, our future Pacific base. Our target was Yawata, Japan's heavily guarded Pittsburgh. Yawata, which made 1/5 of all Jap steel. General Wolfe was winning the big gamble. His idea to train our crews while we tested the experimental B-29 was putting both men and planes in combat 6 months sooner. We were doing the impossible. General Stratemeyer, the theater air commander, and Wolf watched 68 superforts become airborne. Almost the entire force ordered for this historic mission. Followed the lead ship named Lady Hamilton. We followed General Blondie Saunders and his pilot, Colonel Howard Engler. We followed the Marines who landed on Saipan this morning. We headed out high over the Yangtze River. Guided by our navigators, we began the long hop across the Yellow Sea. Landfall, Japan. The enemy was waiting. Up came heavy, bursting flak. Nearly 5 miles below lay the sprawling mills that armed the Japs. Jimmy Doolittle had said we'd be back. And we were. 2.5 years after Pearl Harbor, our superforts had struck Japan. Land-based planes dropped bombs through clouds on Yawata. Damage was done to the Kokura arsenal. Punishment to the steel industry was not extensive, but the B-29 Blitz was underway.
A global bomber and a global air force were in operation. The beginning of the end of the Japanese Empire was underscored in exploding bombs that reminded the Japs of Pearl Harbor. The growing systematic waves of destruction had started. From China and later from Saipan, the Allies were forging a huge nutcracker to crush the enemy. General Arnold's determined order, make 'em the biggest, gun 'em the heaviest, and fly 'em the farthest, was carried out. He warned the enemy, no part of the Japanese Empire is now out of our range. No war factory too remote to feel our bombs. The battle for Japan is now underway with full speed ahead.
The next feature story, The Battle for Iwo Jima, gives the real feeling of an assault on a Pacific island. It shows the taking of Mount Suribachi and the historic flag raising, followed by the long, bloody battle to capture the rest of the island from the well-entrenched, ruthless foe.
This is the Pacific as you know it. Wide stretches of water. But this is the Pacific as the Joint Chiefs of Staff view it. A battlefield, a vast fortress-studded plain on which key strongholds anchor a Japanese defense line guarding the heart of the homeland. The American front lines had advanced to Guam and Saipan. Ahead now stood Iwo Jima, the most heavily fortified island in the world. Buried deep underground lay 20 years of Jap preparation for murder. 20,000 of their toughest fighting men waited for us to make the first move.
And they don't have to wait long. The Navy begins to soften up the island so we can land. Our carrier force take off to strafe and bomb. close to work over enemy beach installations. Fire gets closer. The toughest 26 days in Marine Corps history. We watch the central control vessel. When this flag drops, our landing craft will head for the beach. Landing craft in 10 waves advance on 3,000 yards of beach. Keeps us pinned down. We want to pull the beach over our heads like a blanket. Maybe medical corpsmen get our wounded out fast. Our tanks come ashore and grind inland. We were able to advance from Yellow Beach, but it's slow going. Trouble on Green Beach. From their fortified positions on Mount Suribachi, the Japs look right down our throats.
all the command ships standing offshore. Our message is received. The situation map is checked. The support air director contacts carrier planes circling the target. The flight leader receives his instructions. Suribachi from the air, supporting ships deliver point-blank fire. After 72 hours of continuous pounding, our patrols moved forward. A mortar barrage searches out hidden machine gun nests. Keep a sharp lookout for snipers. Admiral Turner gives the order to cease fire. Our guns are quiet as they make the climb. We wait for a sign. Suribachi is ours. Suribachi is ours. A toehold on the southern tip of the island. But ahead, the main strength of the Jap garrison was entrenched in steel and concrete. The show was just beginning. Navy and Coast Guardsmen rushed supplies ashore for the big push north. Saw a Jap, but fire was coming out of every hole and every rock. It was tough going. Many didn't make it. Crossfire ahead is murderous. Rocket trucks go into action. position. We don't even have time to remove our dead. There are heavy defenses on the ridges overlooking this plain. They draw a bead on us again. They chased us off there 5 times. We came back 6. We brought in our wounded, and we took a breather. The injured are carried to the rear. Plasma's given on the way. Hospital dugouts are ready for anything. And we are ready to advance again. We call for artillery. Artillery duel develops at night. One of our ammunition dumps goes up. In 2 weeks, we have cleaned out plenty of Japs between here and Suribachi. But there's still a lot of island to be taken, with thousands of Japs fighting from blockhouses, pillboxes, and caves. We have to go in and dig them out, one by one. We burn them out. While we fought, we prayed. Along the beach was only a small part of the cost of 26 days of fighting. little Queenie. And there were other names, too. Names of our friends. We stacked the helmets of our dead in neat piles. Helmets of 4,000 men who died to take a tiny island somewhere in the Pacific.
You're right, Marine. You've taken a tiny island. But it's not just 8 square miles of rock. Today, it's an American fortress only 4 hours from Tokyo. Today, from your little island, giant striking forces are launched against the heart of Japan. Today, our planes and ships are blasting the enemy into ashes at the foot of Fujiyama.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
Our chronological account now turns back to Europe, where the next great crisis was the massive German counteroffensive in the Ardennes during December 1944, which became known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a massive attack along a 50-mile bend forced in the Allied line, and it caught the Allied High Command by surprise. I described that operation in my book, The Bitter Woods, published in 1969. In effect, it was Hitler's last gasp. As the Nazi spearhead hit the lightly defended territory between the 1st and 3rd Armies, it essentially destroyed communications between them. Therefore, General Eisenhower found it necessary to place the 1st and 9th Armies under British Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group on a temporary basis, with orders to attack von Rundstedt's forces from the north. At the same time, Patton's 3rd Army was to attack northward against the southern shoulder from the south. Allied mobility and the enemy's lack of resources caused the German offensive to collapse. The original line was restored by mid-January 1945. It was a decisive, bitterly fought battle. At its end, no doubt remains as to the outcome of the war in Europe. Incidentally, one of the interesting aspects of that battle was Patton's turn 100 miles to the north to relieve General Anthony McAuliffe's 101st Airborne Division, surrounded at Bastogne. As the end of the European war approached, American soldiers overran Nazi concentration camps where millions of innocent civilians had been systematically worked to death or slaughtered. General Eisenhower was among the soldiers who witnessed these camps. He couldn't believe his eyes. The horror, the inhumanity, the atrocities left him visibly shaken. Old Blood and Guts Patton, who was with him, became violently ill and went to a corner to throw up. This video concludes with the unconditional surrender of Japan aboard the battleship USS Missouri, which took place in September 1945, 4 months after the end of the war in Europe.
There is an ancient saying that all roads lead to Rome. If that is true, the United States Army had taken the longest and toughest road. Arriving on the 4th of June, 1944, 2 years and 6 months after Pearl Harbor and America's entrance into the war. Two days after General Mark Clark's Fifth Army captured the Eternal City, General Dwight D. Eisenhower's invasion forces hit the Normandy beaches in a massive amphibious assault. Despite bitter German resistance, we built up an enormous beachhead and finally broke through. Our 7th Army, commanded by General Alexander Patch, landed in southern France and pushed northward along the Rhone River Valley. 10 days later, Paris was liberated. Fifth Army crossed the Arno River and swept on toward Bologna. In the Pacific, General MacArthur's forces invaded Morotai Island in a giant amphibious leap that put them within 300 miles of the Philippines. General Stilwell was making progress in Burma with his mixed command of hand-picked American infantrymen, Merrill's Marauders, and British and Chinese units. The tide of war was turning against the aggressors with a vengeance. Just 97 days after the 5th Corps of 1st Army had led the assault on Omaha Beach, it had driven 500 miles inland and crossed the German border. The battle for France was nearing its end. The battle for Germany was about to begin. The Nazi Reich was soon to reap full measure of the dragon's teeth it had sown.
Our armies were battering at the gates of the Nazi homeland. General Hodge's First Army drove through the vaunted Siegfried Line, mile upon mile of concrete fortifications and anti-tank emplacements through the city of Aachen. Two years and 7 months after General MacArthur had left the Philippines, he kept his promise to return. On the 20th of October, 1944, his forces invaded the island of Leyte. This, too, was to be no easy parade to victory. Our soldiers were to face an enemy who would fight as their leaders ordered them to fight, to the death. They wanted it that way. They were to get what they asked for. Seven days after MacArthur landed on Leyte, the United States 3rd and 7th Fleets dealt the Japanese Navy its death blow in the battle for the Leyte Gulf. The curtain was rising on the last fast-moving act of the drama of World War II. General Patton's Third Army took Metz. Ahead was the nearby Saar Basin, Germany's second most important industrial district. On the other side of the world, Army B-29 bombers from new bases on Saipan showered bombs on Tokyo, a fiery rain from the heavens to avenge Pearl Harbor. The campaign on Leyte was going well as our forces moved on, capturing the Japanese base at Ormoc along the west coast. Other forces landed on Mindoro Island with no losses. While General MacArthur's forces were driving forward in the Philippines, Patton's Third Army penetrated the Saar and drove on across the Saar River. A record-breaking fleet of 1,600 United States heavy bombers blasted Frankfurt and other German cities. The Nazis were reaping a bitter and devastating harvest from the seeds they had once sown from the air. Now the very perpetrators of aerial blitzkrieg saw their own cities reduced to rubble. To the millions of Nazi war victims, here at last was a measure of retribution against their merciless executioners. Some of the bitterest fighting of the war took place on the Cologne Plain. Our push toward the industrial Ruhr was resisted every step of the way. Then, on the 16th of December, 1944, the German counteroffensive struck. German Field Marshal von Rundstedt suddenly sent a dozen elite divisions smashing into the Ardennes sector. Von Rundstedt had cast the dice for high stakes, crossing the Meuse River, driving toward Liège, and trying to cut the Allied communication lines from Antwerp to the front lines. If our lines of communication could be cut, the fate of our armies might be in the balance. This was the Battle of the Bulge. Combat and non-combat troops were suddenly and necessarily fighting side by side in worsening winter weather. Grabbing their weapons, they dug in and responded to the old military axiom of hanging on to buy time until reinforcements would come. General Eisenhower took immediate action to meet the crisis. He put the 1st and 9th Armies north of the Bulge under command of Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group, with orders to attack from the north. Patton's Third Army was to attack from the south. Two airborne divisions were rushed in. The 101st was ordered to hold the vital communication center at Bastogne. It was during this action in besieged Bastogne that General MacAuliffe, who was then commanding the 101st, made his famous reply to the German demand that he surrender. That reply was reportedly one word long: nuts. If the enemy did not immediately understand the meaning of MacAuliffe's typical American reply, the action which followed undoubtedly convinced him that it meant that the Americans had no intention of surrendering. Just 6 days after von Rundstedt had launched his counteroffensive, elements of Patton's Third Army, racing up from the south, struck the German on his southern flank. The pressure was off the 101st Airborne. The 1st American Army attacked from the north. After the British struck the Bulge on the west, the 3rd Army smashed on north to link up with the 1st Army. Then the weather cleared, and our planes took to the air, blasting von Rundstedt's forces. The Battle of the Bulge was soon over. The enemy was retreating. The Germans had thrown their last big Sunday punch of the war. While the Battle of the Bulge was going on in Europe, the 8th Army, commanded by General Robert L. Eichelberger, was battling stiff Japanese resistance on Leyte in the Pacific. The fight for Leyte would continue for months, until nearly 50,000 fanatical Japanese would be annihilated. Our forces were spreading out in the Philippines. 6th Army troops landed on Luzon in the Lingayen Gulf and swept southward to capture Tarlac, only 65 miles from Manila. "15 days later, men of the 1st Cavalry Division fought their way into Manila. The capture of Manila included the Santo Tomas prison camp. Along with the Filipino people, these prisoners had waited in long and quiet agony for this moment of liberation. Of all the liberated peoples in the world, none showed more gratitude than did the Filipinos. They well knew we had come not for conquest, but to keep a solemn promise to return and destroy the aggressor, who had taken over their homeland in a war of conquest. Less than 2 years later, the Philippines would be given complete independence as a sovereign nation by the United States. "13 days after the fall of Manila, our airborne troops landed on Corregidor. 2 years and 9 months after the Japanese had hauled down our flag. It had been a long and bloody road, but we had returned. Who and where were those who once had said the American was no soldier, that he would not fight? All around the world, climactic events were swiftly gaining momentum. Our 9th Army, under General Simpson, crossed the Rhine on the 2nd of March. 4 days later, General Hodges' First Army occupied Cologne. 4 days after that, 300 of our superfortresses blasted Tokyo. By the 17th of the same month, General Patton's Third Army had taken Koblenz. The next day, and half a world away, our troops invaded Panay Island in the central Philippines. 3 days after that, Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine. 4 days later, General Eichelberger's Eighth Army was landing on Cebu in the Philippines. Less than a week after that, on the 1st of April, 1945, the United States 10th Army, under General Simon Buckner, invaded Okinawa. On the 11th of the same month, the 2nd Armored Division of the 9th Army reached the Elbe, only 63 miles from Berlin. The 3rd captured Coburg. On the 12th of April, death took the Commander-in-Chief, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had lived to see the triumphant advances of American arms, but fate had denied him the satisfaction that final victory would bring. Less than a month after President Roosevelt's death, Germany surrendered. Hitler was dead by his own hand. Only a few days before, Mussolini had been killed by Italian partisans. To his home shores, General Eisenhower returned in triumph. But in the Pacific, a war was still going on, a big and bitterly fought war, with the end not yet in sight. Okinawa was a bloody battleground, as our 10th Army was finding out. It took us 82 days of continuous fighting to take Okinawa. Kamikaze attacks on our Navy took a heavy toll, but we fought back, never letting up. All the military might of the United States would now be concentrated on the Japanese homeland. A tough job lay ahead, a job that would take men and equipment. Our entire military strength was now aimed at the one remaining Axis partner. Our military planners estimated that in an all-out assault upon Japan itself, our invasion forces would probably suffer 1.5 million casualties. But a new and terrifying force had come into the world, which was to prevent those 1.5 million casualties, the atomic bomb. 2 of these awesome weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought Japan to her knees. On the 2nd of September 1945, Japanese officials signed the Articles of Formal Surrender on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay.